the woman everyone remembers. But almost no one understands Patsey is remembered as the woman who screamed. That is how history usually introduces her. The woman whipped until her back split open, the woman who begged for death, the woman whose pain shocked audiences in stories of American slavery. But that version of Patsey is incomplete, because Patsey was not defined by suffering alone. She was defined by what slavery did to a woman who could not escape, even when escape was visible, imaginable, and technically possible. Her story is not about chains and fields alone. It is about sexual ownership, psychological captivity, and the unique violence reserved for enslaved women whose bodies were desired as much as they were exploited. Patsey lived in Louisiana in the 1840s and 1850s, on a plantation owned by Edwin Epps. She was young. She was intelligent. She was extraordinarily capable. By Epps's own admission, she was the most productive worker on the plantation. She picked more cotton than anyone else. She endured more labor than anyone else, and because of that, she became trapped in a nightmare with no exit. Patsey was not merely enslaved, she was claimed. Edwin Epps raped her repeatedly, not secretly, not occasionally, but openly, as an entitlement of ownership. His wife knew. The plantation knew. The system knew. And no one intervened because there was nothing to intervene against. The law did not recognize rape when the victim was enslaved. Patsey's body belonged to someone else by statute. That fact shaped every moment of her life. Her pain did not come from labor alone. It came from being trapped between a man who abused her and a woman who hated her for being abused. Mistress Epps directed her rage not at her husband, but at Patsey. Jealousy, humiliation, and powerlessness transformed into cruelty. Patsey was punished not only for existing, but for being desired. This is the part of slavery that is hardest to confront because it was not accidental. It was not exceptional. It was structural. Patsey could not leave. She could not refuse. She could not appeal. She could not protect herself. Every day she lived under the threat of violence from both directions, sexual violence from her enslaver and physical punishment from his wife. There was no safe behavior. Obedience did not protect her. Excellence did not protect her. Silence did not protect her. And yet, Patsey survived inside this system long enough to become one of the clearest windows into its cruelty. We know Patsey's story primarily through the account of a man who witnessed it, Solomon Northup, a free black man, kidnapped into slavery and forced to labor on the same plantation. Through his testimony, Patsey emerges not as a background figure, but as a central truth of Slavery 1 that exposes how deeply violence was woven into daily life. But even Northup could not fully capture her interior world. What did it mean to wake up every day knowing your body was not your own? What did it mean to be envied and despised for something you could not control? What did it mean to want death not as escape, but as rest? Patsey asked for death, not once, not impulsively, but after years of understanding exactly what awaited her every morning. That request is one of the most haunting moments in American history, not because it was dramatic, but because it was rational within the system that surrounded her. Patsey did not want to die because she hated life. She wanted to die because slavery had made living indistinguishable from torture. Her story is not about weakness. It is about what happens when a system removes every path to dignity and then condemns the despair it creates. And that is why Patsey matters, because she forces us to confront a version of slavery that cannot be softened, cannot be romanticized, and cannot be explained away as economic necessity. She exposes slavery as a system that weaponized desire, gender, and power against those it enslaved. This documentary is not about watching Patsey suffer. It is about understanding why her suffering was inevitable, why it was permitted, and why the system required it to continue. And once you understand that, it becomes impossible to look away when being valud Bekami, a death sentence. Patsey was born into slavery in Louisiana sometime in the early 1830s. We do not know the exact year, Slavery rarely preserves such details for the enslaved. What we do know is that she grew up inside a system that evaluated human beings by output, obedience, and vulnerability. From childhood, Patsey learned that survival depended not on safety, but on usefulness. Louisiana slavery was particularly brutal. The sugar and cotton plantations of the Deep South were not transitional spaces. They were endpoints. Enslaved people sold into Louisiana were often described as being sent downriver, a phrase that carried dread because it usually meant harsher labor, fewer chances of escape, and near total isolation from family. Mortality rates were high. Punishment was severe. The law was unambiguous in its protection of enslavers. Patsey entered adulthood in this environment. She was physically strong, mentally sharp, and relentlessly productive. On the plantation owned by Edwin Epps, productivity mattered more than almost anything else. Enslaved people were driven to meet quotas enforced by whips. Falling short meant punishment. Meeting expectations did not bring relief. It only raised expectations further. Patsey excelled. She picked more cotton than anyone else on the plantation. Day after day, she outperformed the men and women working beside her. This should have made her safer. In another kind of world, excellence might have offered protection. In slavery, it did the opposite. Her productivity made her indispensable, which meant she could not be sold easily or spared. She became fixed in place, trapped in a role that demanded everything from her body while offering nothing in return. And because she was young and capable, she also became a target. Edwin Epps noticed her. This attention was not admiration. It was ownership asserting itself. Enslaved women were legally unprotected against sexual violence. An enslaver did not need secrecy or justification. The law recognized his authority over her body as complete. Patsey could not refuse. Refusal would have been treated as insubordination, punishable by whipping, confinement, or worse. Silence did not equal consent. It equaled survival under threat. What happened to Patsey was not an affair. It was systematic rape, enabled and normalized by the institution itself. This placed Patsey in an impossible position. She was abused by the man who owned her, and punished by the woman who resented her for that abuse. Mistress Epps directed her anger toward Patsey. Because the system gave her no power over her husband, Patsey became the visible outlet for humiliation and jealousy, despite having no control over what was done to her. Every direction was dangerous. If Patsey resisted Edwin Epps, she would be beaten. If she endured his abuse, she would be punished by his wife. If she tried to disappear, her productivity made that impossible. There was no behavior that led to safety. This is what made Patsey's situation uniquely devastating. She was not being punished for failure. She was being punished for existing within a system that demanded her labor and her body simultaneously. Enslaved men faced horrific violence, but enslaved women like Patsey faced an additional layer. Their bodies were sites of labor, reproduction, and domination. They were expected to absorb violence quietly and remain functional. Patsey did not break immediately. She worked. She endured. She complied when forced. She carried the weight of daily exploitation while watching the system close tighter around her. Over time, it became clear that nothing she did would change her position. There was no future where she aged into safety. No marriage recognized by law. No family she could protect. No appeal she could make. Her value ensured her captivity. This is the cruelty at the center of her story. Patsey was not destroyed because she was useless. She was destroyed because she was too useful to be allowed relief, and too vulnerable to be protected. Slavery required this contradiction to function. It is here, in this slow realization, that Patsey's later despair begins to make sense. Her suffering was not the result of a single beating or a single act of violence. It was the cumulative effect of a system that offered no imaginable exit. By the time others noticed her pain, Patsey had already learned something devastatingly clear. Excellence did not lead to freedom, and endurance did not lead to mercy. They led only to more control. A plantation destined to break people, not just work them. Life on Edwin Epps's plantation followed a rhythm that was both rigid and unpredictable. And that unpredictability was part of the control. Days began before sunrise and ended only when the quota was met or punishment had been delivered. Enslaved people did not measure time by hours, but by exhaustion. Every morning reset the threat. Work was not simply labor. It was surveillance. Cotton picking was measured publicly. Each person's output was weighed and announced. Falling short was not a private failure. It was a spectacle. Whippings were administered in front of others to ensure that fear circulated efficiently. Pain was instructional. It taught people where the limits were and what happened when those limits were crossed. For Patsey, this environment carried a double weight. She consistently exceeded quotas. That made her indispensable to Epps and a living reminder to others of what the system demanded. Her productivity was used as a weapon against the rest of the enslaved community. If Patsey could do it, why couldn't they? Her body became the benchmark by which others were punished. This created isolation. Resentment grew, not because Patsey was cruel or arrogant, but because the system forced comparison. Slavery thrived on dividing people who should have been allies. Patsey did not choose this role. It was imposed on her, and it cut her off from the possibility of solidarity that might have offered some protection. Punishment on the plantation was not reserved for disobedience alone. It was used to assert dominance, release frustration, and reinforce hierarchy. Edwin Epps whipped people not only when they failed, but when he was angry, drunk, or humiliated. His authority was personal and unchecked. Mistress Epps added another layer of cruelty. She targeted Patsey obsessively. Any perceived slight looking the wrong way, being in the wrong place, existing too visibly, could trigger punishment. Mistress Epps's anger was fueled by powerlessness within her marriage and redirected downward. Slavery allowed her to express that rage without consequence. Patsey lived at the intersection of these violences. She was punished for being productive. She was punished for being desired. She was punished for being resented. There was no version of herself that could avoid harm. Daily life meant navigating constant threat. Patsey learned to anticipate moods, to read silences, to move carefully without drawing attention. Even so, attention found her. Her body marked her as unavoidable. The plantation was small. Privacy did not exist. Escape was nearly impossible. The geography mattered. Louisiana plantations were surrounded by swamps, patrolled roads, and distant markets. Enslaved people were cut off from free communities. Running meant navigating terrain that could kill you even without pursuit. Being caught meant brutal punishment or death. Patsey knew this. She watched others fail. She watched people broken publicly as warnings. She saw how quickly hope turned into spectacle. The plantation taught its lessons relentlessly, and Patsey absorbed them all. This is why her later pleas for death cannot be dismissed as despair alone. They were assessments. She understood the system fully. She understood that nothing within it would improve her condition. She understood that her productivity guaranteed her continued abuse. And she understood that time would not soften the violence. It would only accumulate it. Slavery is often discussed as an economic system. On the Epps plantation, it was also a psychological one. It was designed to teach people that endurance was the only option, even when endurance meant unending violation. Patsey learned this lesson too well. Her suffering was visible. Solomon Northup saw it. Others saw it. Everyone knew what was happening to her. And still, nothing intervened. This is perhaps the most devastating aspect of her story. Not that violence occurred, but that it occurred openly, predictably, and without challenge. Patsey was not invisible. She was unprotected, and in a system like this, being seen did not lead to help. It led to more control, a body the law refused to protect. Patsey's suffering cannot be understood without confronting a truth that American law carefully avoided naming. For enslaved women, sexual violence was not a crime, it was a condition. What happened to Patsey was not hidden, and it was not rare. It was enabled by statutes that defined enslaved women as property and stripped them of legal personhood. On Edwin Epps's plantation, rape did not require secrecy. It required ownership. Epps's access to Patsey's body was not considered immoral by the legal system. It was considered his right. Enslaved women could not testify against white men. They could not claim violation. They could not appeal to courts that recognized their bodily autonomy. The law did not fail them accidentally. It excluded them by design. This legal reality shaped every interaction Patsey had. There was no that could be spoken safely. There was no consent that could be recognized. There was no refuge the law would honor. When Epps assaulted Patsey, he did so knowing there would be no consequence. When his wife punished Patsey for it, she did so knowing the law would not intervene. The system ensured that blame flowed downward, never upward. This dynamic trapped Patsey between two forms of violence that reinforced each other. Epps's assaults asserted domination. Mistress Epps's punishments enforced humiliation. Together, they created a closed circuit of cruelty with Patsey at its center. Every attempt to assert dignity, every moment of visible pain, became a justification for further punishment. Even Patsey's suffering was treated as provocation. The psychological impact was relentless. Patsey learned that her body was a battleground she could not leave. She learned that her presence itself was the offense. She learned that compliance did not reduce harm, it only made harm routine. Over time, this eroded not only hope, but the very concept of future. This is why Patsey's request for death later shocked witnesses. From the outside, it appeared extreme. From the inside, it was coherent. Death represented the only boundary the system could not cross. It was the only condition under which Epps's control would end. The only state where Mistress Epps's rage could no longer reach her. That calculus is horrifying, but it was produced by the system, not by Patsey. Sexual violence under slavery was not an aberration that corrupted an otherwise functional institution. It was a tool. It reinforced power, rewarded dominance, and terrorized communities into compliance. Enslaved women were expected to absorb this violence silently while remaining productive. Patsey could not because she was weak, but because the violence was total. She did not have the option to compartmentalize pain. There was no private space where healing could occur. There was no night free from threat, no morning free from fear. Even her labor, the one thing she controlled with excellence, was turned against her as proof that she could endure more. Witnesses saw this. Solomon Northup observed how Patsey was singled out, how her punishments were disproportionate, how her despair deepened over time. He recorded her words because they were impossible to forget. When Patsey begged for death, she was not dramatizing suffering. She was articulating a logical endpoint to a life without exit. This is what the law made possible. By refusing to recognize enslaved women as legal subjects, it transformed their bodies into sites of sanctioned violence. By denying them voice, it ensured that suffering would remain normalized. By protecting owners absolutely, it guaranteed that cruelty could escalate unchecked. Patsey's story forces us to name this reality plainly. She was not harmed because the law was broken. She was harmed because the law was obeyed. Understanding this is essential. Without it, Patsey's despair appears tragic but inexplicable. With it, her despair becomes a rational response to a system that offered no relief, no justice, and no escape. Her breaking point was not sudden, it was engineered. The moment she escaped for death, and why it was logical. There are moments in the history of slavery that stop people cold, not because they are sensational, but because they are clear. Patsey's request for death is one of those moments. It is remembered because it cuts through every excuse, every abstraction, every attempt to soften what slavery meant in practice. Patsey did not whisper her request in passing. She did not say it once in despair, and then take it back. She asked deliberately, after years of understanding exactly what her life was and what it would never become. She asked Solomon Northup to kill her. This is not a metaphor. It is not a figure of speech. She asked another enslaved person, someone she trusted, someone who had shown her basic human recognition to end her life, and she did so calmly enough that Northup was shaken not by hysteria, but by certainty. She told him she could not live like this anymore, not because she had suffered a single beating, not because of one assault, but because there was no end point. She knew she would be raped again. She knew she would be punished again. She knew tomorrow would look exactly like today, and she knew that aging would not protect her. Slavery did not grant retirement. It did not grant respect. It did not grant release. It only shifted how pain was administered. Patsey understood that the system would keep taking from her until there was nothing left. What haunted Northup was not just the request, but the reasoning behind it. Patsey explained that death was the only state in which she would belong to herself. It was the only place Edwin Epps could not reach her. The only place Mistress Epps could not punish her. The only place the law could not claim her body as property. This was not suicidal ideation in the modern sense. It was a calculation under absolute domination. Patsey was not choosing between life and death as abstract values. She was choosing between endless violation and final autonomy. The system had narrowed her options until death appeared not as destruction, but as relief. Northup refused. He could not bring himself to do it. He feared punishment. He feared damnation. He feared participating in what the system had already done to her. His refusal did not come from lack of compassion. It came from terror of the same forces that trapped Patsey. When he refused, Patsey did not rage. She accepted it. That acceptance is what makes the moment unbearable. She did not argue. She did not plead further. She returned to her labor, knowing that the one person she trusted could not help her, and that the system would continue exactly as before. This moment reveals something crucial about slavery that statistics never can. It shows that despair was not accidental. It was not individual weakness. It was not failure to endure. It was the predictable outcome of a system designed to deny every path to dignity. Patsey's request for death did not shock those who truly understood slavery. It shocked those who needed to believe that endurance was always possible, that survival was always preferable, that patience was always virtuous. Patsey destroyed that illusion. She demonstrated that there are conditions under which survival becomes indistinguishable from torture. And when that happens, the moral language used by free societies collapses. Her plea forces a question that still unsettles audiences. If a system makes death feel like freedom, where does the moral responsibility lie? With the person who asks for release, or with the system that makes release impossible by any other means? Patsey did not receive death. She received continuation, and that continuation the knowledge that tomorrow would bring the same violence, the same humiliation, the same entrapment, is what ultimately defines her story. Not the act of asking, but the fact that asking made sense. This is why Patsey matters, because she exposes the point at which a system crosses from cruelty into total domination. She reveals the moment when suffering is no longer something to be endured, but something to be escaped at any cost. And once that point is reached, the system has already failed, no matter how orderly it appears from the outside. When the system, Ansford desperate with published torture after Patsey asked for death, nothing softened, nothing paused. In a system built on domination, despair was not a warning sign, it was a challenge. And challenges had to be answered publicly. Patsey became a target, not because she had disobeyed, but because she had revealed something Edwin Epps could not tolerate: the limits of his control. Her request for death was not heard as pain, it was heard as defiance. Epps responded the way slave systems always responded to perceived defiance: by escalating violence. The whipping that followed was not corrective. It was demonstrative. It was meant to erase the idea that Patsey had any interior life worth acknowledging. It was meant to remind everyone watching that the body of an enslaved person existed for discipline, not for listening. This punishment was not carried out in private. It was staged. Enslaved people were forced to witness it. Solomon Northup was ordered to assist, compelled to participate in the violence under threat of punishment himself. This was not incidental. Slavery required shared trauma. It required victims to become unwilling instruments, spreading terror through complicity. Patsey was tied down. Each slash tore into skin already scarred from years of punishment. Her body bore the history of the system. Old wounds reopened, New ones added. Mistress Epps stood nearby, watching closely, demanding more. Her jealousy and rage were now sanctioned through violence. This is one of the most difficult truths to confront. Enslaved women were often punished most brutally, not despite their exploitation, but because of it. Patsey's sexual abuse by Epps had made her a symbol of humiliation within the household. Instead of confronting her husband, Mistress Epps directed that humiliation downward. Slavery gave her that outlet. It allowed her to reclaim a sense of power by destroying someone who could not resist. The whipping continued until Patsey collapsed. Not metaphorically, physically. Her screams were not pleas for mercy. They were involuntary responses to pain so extreme that the body could no longer contain it. This was not about discipline. It was about erasure. It was about demonstrating that Patsey's suffering would never be allowed to challenge the authority that produced it. What followed is often overlooked. Patsey did not rebel afterward. She did not flee. She did not receive protection. She returned to work. This return is sometimes mistaken for resilience. It is not. It is evidence of total captivity. Patsey's body had been used as a warning, a spectacle, and a release valve for the rage of others. And then it was expected to continue producing value, as if nothing had happened. That expectation reveals the true logic of slavery. Pain was not a problem. Pain was a resource. The psychological damage of this moment cannot be separated from the physical. Patsey had asked for death because she understood there was no boundary the system would respect. The whipping confirmed that understanding completely. It showed her that even articulating despair would be punished, that even clarity would be met with cruelty. This is where many narratives falter. They treat the whipping as the climax. It is not. It is confirmation. It confirms that Patsey's assessment of her life was accurate, that there would be no mercy, that suffering was not an accident but a guarantee. Solomon Northup never forgot this moment. He recorded it not because it was unusual, but because it was exemplary. It showed slavery as it functioned when stripped of pretense. No paternalism, no benevolence, just ownership, asserting itself through violence. Patsey survived the whipping. But survival, again, must be named honestly. She survived in the sense that her heart continued beating, but something else was extinguished. The possibility that the system could ever be reasoned with, appealed to, or endured into safety. After this, Patsey did not ask for death again. She did not need to. The system had answered her already. When everyone saw, and no one could intervene after the whipping, Patsey did not become invisible. She became understood, and that understanding spread quietly across the plantation in a way that words never could. Everyone who worked the fields with her, everyone who lived in the quarters, everyone who watched her walk with scars that never fully healed knew exactly what her life represented. They also knew there was nothing they could do. This is one of the most corrosive aspects of slavery that is often missed. It did not only brutalize individuals, it forced entire communities into paralysis. Witnessing suffering without the ability to intervene created a second layer of violence, one that hollowed people out from the inside. The enslaved people around Patsey were not indifferent. They were trapped. If someone spoke up, they would be punished. If someone interfered, they would be whipped or killed. If someone tried to protect her, they would become the next example. Slavery made solidarity dangerous. This is why Patsey's suffering unfolded in public, but remained unanswered. The system depended on witnesses who were powerless. It created an environment where compassion became a liability and silence became a survival strategy. Solomon Northup felt this acutely. He saw Patsey's pain. He understood her reasoning. He recognized that her request for death came from clarity, not madness. And yet, he could not save her. He could not shield her. He could not even refuse to participate in her punishment without risking his own life. This helplessness haunted him. Northup later wrote about Patsey not because she was the only person who suffered, but because her suffering revealed the full architecture of slavery. She showed how power operated not only through whips and laws, but through enforced inaction. People were made complicit not because they agreed, But because refusal meant annihilation, Patsey became a symbol among the enslaved, not of rebellion, but of truth. She represented the endpoint of endurance. She showed what happened when a person did everything demanded of them and still received nothing but abuse. Her presence shattered the illusion that obedience led to protection. This knowledge changed how others saw their own lives. Some hardened themselves emotionally. Some withdrew inward. Some lost the ability to imagine futures at all. Slavery thrived on this erosion of hope. Even those who despised what was happening to Patsey were forced to adapt to it. They learned to look away when they had to. They learned to suppress anger. They learned that empathy without power could destroy you. This is why Patsey's story is not just about her. It is about the collective damage inflicted by systems that normalize cruelty and punish resistance. Her suffering radiated outward, shaping the emotional landscape of everyone around her. It taught people what the boundaries were and how unforgiving they were. And yet, something else happened too. Patsey's endurance, however forced, created a kind of quiet testimony. She lived as evidence that the system could not be endured into dignity. That realization did not always produce action, but it did produce memory. People remembered. They carried her story forward silently. And the way enslaved communities preserved truth when speaking openly was dangerous. They did not need to narrate it in full. A glance, a scar, a name spoken carefully was enough. This is how truth survived inside captivity, not through speeches, not through protest, but through shared recognition of what should never have been allowed to happen. Patsey could not be saved, but she was not alone in being seen, and that seeing painful, helpless, unresolved was itself a threat to the system. Because systems built on domination rely on denial. They depend on people believing that suffering is exaggerated, isolated, or deserved. Patsey made that belief impossible for those who knew her. Her life did not inspire revolt. It inspired clarity, and clarity, once shared, does not disappear. After the witness left, the silence closed in. When Solomon Northup was finally freed in 1853, something essential disappeared from Patsey's life. A witness who would survive. Northup left the plantation alive, able to speak, able to write, able to carry memory beyond the reach of Edwin Epps. Patsey did not. And this is where her story becomes even more unsettling, because once Northup was gone, Patsey vanished from the historical record almost completely. Patsey did not receive emancipation in a way that left documentation. She did not leave letters. She did not testify. She did not appear in court cases. She did not show up in census records under her own name. The woman whose suffering became one of the most vivid testimonies of slavery was swallowed back into anonymity. This disappearance is not accidental. Slavery was designed to erase people once they were no longer useful as symbols. Patsey's pain had served its purpose inside the plantation, to enforce fear. Once Northup was gone, there was no reason to preserve her story. The system did not need her memory. It needed her labor. We do not know what happened to Patsey after 1853. She may have remained on the Epps plantation until the Civil War. She may have been sold downriver, where records thin further. She may have died young from injury, infection, or exhaustion. She may have lived long enough to see emancipation without ever receiving relief. The absence of certainty is itself revealing. Slavery kept meticulous records of profits, crops, and transactions. It did not preserve the lives of the people it consumed. When Patsey disappears, it is not because her life lacked significance. It is because the system had no incentive to remember her once she could no longer be used to discipline others. This is another layer of violence. Physical abuse harms the body. Sexual abuse harms the self. Erasure harms memory. Patsey's disappearance ensured that the most exploited people would not shape the narrative of what had been done to them. Without Northup's account, Patsey would likely be known only as an unnamed figure if she were known at all. That near erasure matters. It means that everything we know about Patsey comes through the eyes of someone else, however sympathetic, It means her interior life, the full range of her thoughts, memories, strategies, and moments of resistance, is largely lost. It means that the system succeeded, in part, in what it always attempted, making suffering temporary and invisible once it had served its purpose. And yet, her story did not disappear entirely. It survived because Northup refused to sanitize it. He did not soften her pain or turn it into allegory. He recorded her words. He described her despair without judgment. He made her suffering impossible to dismiss as exaggeration. That survival of memory is fragile. For decades, Patsey was treated as a background figure in Northup's narrative, important but secondary. Readers focused on Northup's freedom, not on those he left behind. This, too, reflects a pattern. Histories often center escape, not entrapment, survival, not those who remained. Patsey challenges that focus. Her story insists that freedom narratives are incomplete without the stories of those who did not escape, who could not escape, or who were never meant to escape at all. She forces recognition that slavery's cruelty cannot be measured only by who got out, but by what happened to those who stayed. Her disappearance is not a mystery to be solved. It is a truth to be faced. It tells us that slavery did not end cleanly for most of its victims. It faded into silence, illness, displacement, and forgotten graves. Patsey stands in for millions whose lives were consumed without record, whose pain shaped history without being credited by it. She survived long enough to be seen. Then she was taken back into a system that specialized in making sure people like her were never heard from again. That is not a failure of documentation. It is a feature of domination. When memory returned, and what it got wrong for a long time, Patsey existed only as a fragment, an unforgettable presence inside someone else's story. Readers remembered the whipping. They remembered the plea for death. They remembered the brutality, but they rarely asked what that memory was doing, or what it risked becoming when repeated without care. Patsey began to reappear in the 20th and 21st centuries as America revisited slavery through books, classrooms, and screens. Her name resurfaced because it carried undeniable force. It condensed the cruelty of the institution into a single human figure. That made her visible again, but visibility brought new problems. Memory is not neutral. When Patsey returned to public consciousness, she was often reduced to a symbol of suffering rather than a person shaped by specific conditions. Retellings emphasized spectacle over structure, pain over causation. The image of her body became more recognizable than the system that produced the violence done to it. This distortion matters. When suffering is isolated from its context, it risks becoming consumable. Audiences react emotionally but do not necessarily reckon with responsibility. Patsey's pain can provoke outrage without prompting examination of how sexual violence, labor exploitation, and legal erasure work together as a system. There's also a gendered problem in how her story is remembered. Male narratives of slavery often emphasize endurance followed by escape or liberation. Patsey's story offers no such arc. She does not escape. She does not triumph. She does not even leave a voice behind. This makes her difficult to integrate into stories that prefer resolution. As a result, she is sometimes frozen at her worst moment. This freezing has consequences. It risks turning Patsey into an object lesson, rather than a subject with an interior life. It risks repeating the logic of slavery itself, using her body to teach others something, while denying her complexity. Yet, memory has also done something important. By returning to Patsey repeatedly, writers and historians have forced a confrontation with aspects of slavery that were long minimized or denied: sexual violence, gendered punishment, and psychological captivity. Her story has become a gateway to discussing what the law refused to name. This is where representation matters. When Patsey is remembered carefully, her story expands understanding. It connects sexual exploitation to labor discipline. It shows how jealousy and power intersected within slaveholding households. It reveals how law protected perpetrators while silencing victims. But when she is remembered carelessly, her suffering risks becoming the end of the conversation rather than the beginning. The challenge is not whether to remember Patsey. It is how. To remember her honestly requires resisting simplification. It requires acknowledging that her despair was rational within her circumstances. It requires recognizing that her productivity was a trap, not a virtue rewarded. And it requires refusing to turn her pain into a standalone horror, divorced from the system that guaranteed it. Patsey's return to memory also forces a reckoning with absence. We remember her because someone else survived to tell her story. Countless others did not. Her partial visibility highlights how much has been lost, how many lives passed without record, how many voices were extinguished before they could speak. This realization reframes her importance. Patsey is not remembered because she suffered more than others. She is remembered because her story survived it all. That survival places a responsibility on those who tell it, to use her memory to illuminate structure, not just shock. When done right, remembering Patsey becomes an act of accountability. It holds the system responsible for the violence it normalized. It holds the law responsible for the protections it denied. It holds audiences responsible for what they do with the knowledge once they have it. Patsey does not need to be rescued by memory. She needs to be understood by it. When dissurvival itself became a form of resistance. It is tempting to think of resistance only in terms of action that disrupts, power escape, rebellion, refusal. Patsey's life complicates that definition in ways that are deeply uncomfortable, because she did not resist in any way that brought change. And yet her existence itself undermines the logic of slavery. Patsey resisted not by overthrowing the system, but by refusing to disappear emotionally, even when the system did everything it could to erase her interior life. This kind of resistance does not look heroic. It does not feel victorious. It does not end in freedom. But it matters. Slavery depended on more than forced labor. It depended on psychological domination. It required enslaved people to internalize their status, to believe that their pain was deserved, inevitable, or meaningless. Total control was the goal, not just of bodies, but of belief. Patsey never accepted that lie. Even when she asked for death, she was asserting judgment. She was declaring that what was happening to her was intolerable, not normal. That declaration alone is a form of resistance, because it names injustice rather than absorbing it. Her despair was not surrender, it was testimony. Patsey did not say, "This is my fate." She said, "This should not be happening." That distinction is crucial. Many enslaved people survived by numbing themselves, by shrinking inward, by learning not to hope. Patsey could not do that. Her clarity would not let her. She saw the system too clearly to pretend it was survivable in any meaningful sense. That clarity was punished relentlessly, but it was never extinguished. This is why her story unsettles modern audiences. We want resistance to be effective. We want it to produce outcomes we can point to. Patsey's resistance produced no relief, no escape, no reform, and yet it exposed something fundamental. The system could not break her into believing it was right, even when she continued to work, even when she obeyed, even when she survived. Her obedience was coerced, not internalized. This matters because slavery relied heavily on the myth of consent. It needed enslaved people to appear resigned, manageable, and broken. Patsey's visible suffering disrupted that illusion. She made it impossible to pretend that the system was benign, or that endurance equaled acceptance. Her survival was not proof that slavery could be endured. It was proof that endurance came at an unbearable cost. In this sense, Patsey represents a form of resistance that history struggles to honor. She did not act in ways that fit heroic narratives. She did not choose violence or escape. But she also did not choose psychological submission. She retained the capacity to judge her circumstances as unjust, even when judging changed nothing. That judgment is dangerous to repressive systems. It threatens the idea that domination can be normalized. It exposes that compliance does not mean consent. It shows that survival can coexist with condemnation, and that people can endure without believing. This reframing challenges how we talk about dignity. Dignity is often imagined as something protected by autonomy. Patsey had none. And yet, She retained a sense of self that refused to be reconciled with her treatment. Her dignity did not protect her from harm, but it preserved the truth about that harm. This is why her story must be told carefully. If we only see Patsey as a victim, we miss the depth of what she represented. If we only see her pain, we miss her clarity. And if we only measure resistance by success, we miss the ways people resist simply by refusing to accept injustice as legitimate. Patsey did not survive to be free. She survived to reveal what freedom's absence truly looked like. And that revelation remains one of the most devastating indictments of slavery ever recorded. Not because it ends in triumph, but because it ends in truth. Why her story refuses judgment, and why that makes people uncomfortable. Patsey forces a kind of moral reckoning that many people instinctively resist. Her story does not invite easy conclusions. It does not point clearly toward forgiveness or condemnation, heroism or failure. Instead, it leaves us suspended in an ethical space where judgment itself feels inadequate. This discomfort is not accidental. Modern audiences often approach history looking for moral clarity, someone to praise, someone to blame, a lesson to extract. Patsey's life disrupts that impulse. There is no decision she made that leads to resolution. There is no choice she could have made that would have changed her circumstances in any meaningful way. And that reality challenges how we assign responsibility. People sometimes ask the wrong questions about her. Why didn't she run? Why didn't she fight back? Why didn't she endure quietly like others? These questions assume options that did not exist. Running in Louisiana meant near certain death or torture. Fighting back meant execution. Silence did not bring safety. The system closed every path that might look reasonable from the outside. To judge Patsey's actions or her despair without acknowledging this closure is to misunderstand slavery entirely. Her story forces us to confront a harder truth. There are situations where morality cannot be expressed through action, only through recognition. Patsey recognized the injustice of her condition with absolute clarity. That recognition did not save her. It did not improve her treatment, but it mattered because it preserved the truth of what slavery was doing to human beings. This is where many narratives falter. They want to convert suffering into meaning. They want pain to teach a lesson that leads somewhere. Patsey's life resists that conversion. It does not resolve into redemption. It does not culminate in liberation. It simply ends somewhere, sometime without ceremony or acknowledgement. And that ending is honest. Slavery did not provide closure for most of its victims. It provided exhaustion, disappearance, and unmarked graves. Patsey's story reflects that reality more accurately than stories that end in escape or emancipation. This lack of closure unsettles people because it leaves responsibility unresolved. If Patsey cannot be judged for her despair, then responsibility shifts upward to the system, the law, the society that normalized her abuse. That shift is uncomfortable because it implicates not just historical figures, but the structures and narratives that protected them. Her story also complicates how we think about empathy. It is easy to feel sympathy for Patsey. It is harder to sit with the implications of her experience without trying to soften them. True empathy here does not mean feeling bad. It means refusing to dilute what her life reveals about power, gender, and violence. Patsey does not ask us to feel inspired. She asks us to be honest. Honest about how sexual violence was embedded in slavery. Honest about how law functioned as a weapon rather than a shield. Honest about how survival did not always include hope. That honesty is demanding. It does not offer relief, but it does offer clarity. In the end, Patsey's story teaches us that some histories are not meant to comfort or instruct in neat ways. They are meant to remain open wounds, visible reminders of what happens when a society prioritizes order, profit, and power over humanity. Judging Patsey is easy. Understanding why judgment fails is much harder. And that is precisely why her story still matters. Her story reveals about how slavery is tasered and what gets left out. Patsey exposes a problem not just with how slavery was practiced, but with how it has been remembered, summarized, and taught. Her life sits at the edge of most historical narratives because it disrupts the structure those narratives rely on. Slavery is often taught through timelines, laws, wars, and eventual abolition. Patsey's story does not fit neatly into that arc. There is no progress in her life. There is no turning point that leads to improvement. No moment where suffering produces change. No clear before and after. And because of that, her story is often shortened, simplified, or framed only as an example of brutality rather than a lens into how the system functioned daily. This framing reduces her to a case study rather than a lived reality. One reason this happens is discomfort with gendered violence. Many accounts of slavery focus on labor exploitation because it can be discussed without confronting sexual domination directly. Sexual violence is harder to narrate. It forces recognition that slavery invaded bodies in ways that cannot be justified even by the cold logic of economics. Patsey's story makes avoidance impossible. Her exploitation was not incidental to her labor. It was intertwined with it. Teaching slavery without centering women like Patsey risks presenting a partial truth, one that acknowledges cruelty but avoids its most intimate forms. This selective telling allows audiences to understand slavery as harsh but impersonal, rather than as a system that deliberately weaponized gender and desire. Another issue is the preference for agency narratives. Education often emphasizes figures who resisted visibly, those who escaped, fought back, or left records of defiance. These stories are important, but they are not representative of most enslaved lives. Patsey represents a far more common experience: entrapment without exit, suffering without audience, endurance without reward. Her lack of documented resistance makes her harder to place in narratives that celebrate resilience. But this difficulty is precisely why she matters. Patsey forces educators and audiences to confront the reality that not all resistance looks like action, and not all survival includes hope. She challenges the assumption that history should be organized around triumph. Sometimes the most honest stories are those that refuse triumph entirely. Simplifying her story also risks reproducing harm. When Patsey is remembered only as a victim of extreme violence, her clarity and judgment disappear. She becomes someone things happened to, rather than someone who understood what was happening to her and articulated its meaning. That erasure mirrors the logic of slavery itself, which denied enslaved people intellectual and moral agency. Teaching her story responsibly requires a shift. It requires slowing down. It requires naming sexual violence plainly. It requires acknowledging that law, family, and religion all participated in her captivity. It also requires accepting that some histories end without resolution. Patsey's life does not teach optimism. It teaches precision. It shows how systems maintain power by closing off every alternative and then punishing despair. It shows how cruelty can become routine, and how routine cruelty reshapes what people believe is possible. This has implications beyond slavery. How societies remember Patsey shapes how they recognize suffering today. When stories like hers are rushed past or softened, it becomes easier to ignore forms of domination that persist without dramatic rebellion or visible collapse. Her story trains us to notice harm even when it does not produce spectacle. Patsey is difficult to teach because she demands honesty without consolation. But that difficulty is not a flaw, it is a warning. When history becomes too comfortable, too resolved, too neatly instructive, it risks losing the very truths that matter most. Patsey stands as a reminder that some lives were consumed by systems in ways that cannot be redeemed by narrative closure. Remembering her fully means accepting that freedom, dignity, and the lee that one always follows the other. Patsey forces a confrontation with one of the most persistent myths in how slavery is remembered, the idea that freedom and dignity naturally move together. Her life demonstrates, with devastating clarity, that dignity can exist without freedom, and that freedom, when it comes too late or too incompletely, does not automatically repair what was destroyed. Patsey never experienced freedom in any meaningful sense while her story was being written. And yet, she retained a sense of judgment, of moral clarity, that slavery could not extinguish. That clarity did not protect her body, but it preserved her understanding of what was being done to her. She knew the system was wrong. She knew her suffering was not deserved. She knew there was no future for her within it. This knowledge matters. It challenges the assumption that dignity depends on external conditions alone. Patsey had no legal rights, no autonomy, no protection. But she retained an internal refusal to accept slavery as legitimate. That refusal is not romantic. It did not save her, but it matters because it denies the system its final victory, the rewriting of reality inside the minds of its victims. At the same time, Patsey's story also exposes the limits of freedom when it arrives without repair. Even if Patsey survived long enough to see emancipation, freedom would not have erased what she endured. Freedom would not have returned her stolen years. It would not have healed her body. It would not have undone the psychological captivity shaped by constant violation and punishment. Freedom in that sense would have arrived as absence rather than restoration. This is an uncomfortable truth. Societies often treat emancipation as a moral reset, a moment where injustice ends and balance is restored. Patsey's life reminds us that for many, freedom arrived too late to function as redemption. It stopped future harm, but it did not undo the harm already inflicted. Her story unsettles modern audiences because it resists redemption narratives. There is no moment where suffering is transformed into growth, no arc where pain becomes purpose, no ending where justice compensates for loss. Instead, Patsey leaves us with a question about what justice even means in the aftermath of absolute domination. Is justice the end of the system that harmed her? Is it the remembrance of her suffering? Is it the refusal to sanitize what was done? Patsey does not answer these questions. She leaves them open, unresolved, demanding engagement rather than resolution. That demand is what makes her story difficult to contain within traditional historical frameworks. Her life also reframes how we think about dignity. Dignity is often imagined as something protected by rights and recognition. Patsey had neither, and yet she possessed a sense of self that refused to be reconciled with her treatment. That refusal did not make her safe, but it preserved truth. It preserved the knowledge that what was happening to her was an injustice, not a natural order. This matters for how we understand freedom today. Freedom without protection is fragile. Freedom without repair is incomplete. Freedom without acknowledgement risks becoming another form of silence. Patsey's story insists that dignity is not something granted by systems. It is something systems try to erase, and when they fail to erase it completely, they expose their own moral bankruptcy. Her life remains unsettling because it does not allow audiences to feel finished. You cannot admire her and move on. You cannot condemn the system and feel resolved. You cannot extract a lesson and close the book. Patsey stays with you because her story asks not what happened then, but what it means now to remember a person who was denied justice, denied voice, and denied relief, and to do so without turning her into a symbol that erases her humanity again. She does not offer comfort. She offers clarity, why her story still feels unbearable, and why that feeling matters. Patsey remains one of the hardest figures in the history of American slavery to sit with, not because her suffering was unique, but because it was complete. There is no angle from which her story becomes easier. Time does not soften it. Context does not excuse it. Distance does not dilute it. That unbearable feeling people experience when hearing about Patsey is not a flaw in the story. It is the point. Modern audiences often search for emotional resolution in historical narratives. We want to feel anger and then relief, sadness and then hope, horror followed by justice. Patsey offers none of these exits. Her life resists emotional closure because slavery, as she experienced it, offered no closure either. The discomfort lingers because Patsey's suffering cannot be reframed as accidental, excessive, or exceptional. It was normal. It was legal, it was routine, and that realization is deeply threatening. If Patsey's experience was not an outlier, then slavery was not merely harsh. It was systematically sadistic toward those it exploited most completely. Accepting that forces a reckoning not only with history, but with how long societies were willing to tolerate such cruelty. Another reason her story feels unbearable is that it exposes the limits of empathy. People want to imagine what they would have done differently. They want to insert themselves into the past as helpers, resistors, protectors. Patsy's story offers no space for that fantasy. Everyone around her was either powerless, complicit, or both. There was no role an outsider could step into to fix what was happening. That lack of intervention is not a failure of individuals. It is evidence of a system designed to prevent intervention. Patsy's life demonstrates how oppression works most effectively when it distributes fear so widely that no one can act without becoming a target. This is why her suffering unfolded in full view. Visibility did not equal vulnerability for the system. It reinforced its power. The unbearable nature of her story also comes from its intimacy. Slavery is often discussed in terms of numbers, laws, or economics. Patsey collapses those abstractions into a single human body. Her story forces recognition that domination was not only about labor extraction, but about controlling intimacy, sexuality, and identity. Her pain was not distant. It was daily. It was personal. It was enforced inside homes, not just fields. That closeness makes her story difficult to intellectualize away. Societies often manage unbearable histories by reshaping them, turning them into symbols, metaphors, or morality tales. Patsey resists this transformation. She does not stand in for something else. She stands for herself and for the reality that slavery did not always produce resistance, growth, or redemption. Sometimes it produced exhaustion. That truth is destabilizing. It challenges narratives that rely on progress to make sense of suffering. It questions whether historical injustice can always be redeemed by future change. It insists that some harms remain irreparable, even when systems collapse. Remembering Patsey honestly requires accepting that discomfort is not something to overcome, but something to carry. It means resisting the urge to soften language, resisting the urge to emphasize hope where there was none, resisting the urge to move on too quickly. The unbearable feeling is a moral signal. It tells us that the story is being received correctly. Patsey's life is not meant to reassure us about human resilience or moral advancement. It is meant to warn us about what happens when power operates without accountability, and when suffering is normalized through law and custom. Her story remains heavy because it demands responsibility without offering absolution. And that demand is precisely why it must be remembered. What WEVOW hair, and why remembering her is not optional. Patsey did not leave behind words asking to be remembered. She did not write a narrative. She did not shape her legacy. What survives of her life exists because someone else refused to look away, and because later generations refused to let her disappear completely. That fact alone defines what we owe her. We do not owe Patsey admiration. We do not owe her redemption. We do not owe her a comforting ending. We owe her honesty. Honesty about what slavery required in order to function. Honesty about how much suffering was considered acceptable, legal, and ordinary. Honesty about how women's bodies were turned into instruments of labor, domination, and punishment at the same time. Patsey's story does not exist to teach perseverance. It exists to expose cruelty. Remembering her responsibly means resisting two equally dangerous impulses, turning her into spectacle or turning away entirely. Spectacle reduces her to pain without context. Silence completes the erasure that slavery began. Neither is acceptable. To remember Patsey honestly is to keep the focus where it belongs, not on how shocking her suffering was, but on why it was allowed, who benefited, and how the system protected itself while destroying her. It also means accepting limits. There are questions we will never answer. We will never know what Patsey hoped for when she was alone. We will never know how she made sense of her days after Northup left. We will never know whether she lived to see freedom, or whether freedom meant anything by the time it arrived. That uncertainty is not a gap to be filled with speculation. It is a reminder of how thoroughly enslaved people were denied control over their own stories. Patsey does not belong to us. Her life is not raw material for inspiration. Her pain is not a metaphor. Her endurance is not a lesson in strength. She was a person whose humanity was systematically denied, whose suffering was normalized, and whose clarity about that suffering was punished. Remembering her means refusing to transform that reality into something easier to consume. It also means recognizing what her story demands of the present. Patsey's life challenges any system that treats people as expendable while insisting that order, productivity, or tradition justify harm. Her story returns whenever power denies bodily autonomy, whenever law shields abuse, whenever suffering is dismissed as the cost of doing business. She is not only a figure of the past, she is a warning about what happens when domination becomes routine, a warning about how easily suffering can be justified when it serves power, a warning about how quickly people disappear when their pain is inconvenient. Remembering Patsey is not about achieving closure. It is about refusing amnesia. It is about insisting that the most vulnerable lives are not footnotes, that the stories without happy endings still matter, that history is not only what changed, but what was endured without relief. Patsey was denied justice. Nothing we do can change that. But memory can still do something important. It can refuse the final violence of forgetting. It can keep the truth visible, unresolved, and honest. It can ensure that her life is not reduced to a scene, a symbol, or a moment of shock. She lived, she suffered, she understood, and that understanding, clear-eyed, unsanitized, and devastating, is what she leaves behind. Patsey does not ask us to move on. She asks us to remember what we are capable of becoming when power goes unchecked, and to never allow that forgetting to happen again.